Yeah. Reminding me. So this meeting will be recorded, and I'll make sure that it gets posted somewhere that everyone can see it afterwards as well, so that you can go back and kind of think about it, or pick up on anything or listen more carefully, whatever. So without further ado, we shall make a start. And first of all, I'm going to introduce our two guests that we have with us this morning. As I said, we're really lucky to have both Tice and Polly with us this morning. Polly Barton is the translator of Where the Wild Ladies Are. She is a translator of Japanese literature and non-fiction. And the last thing I've read is that she's currently based in Bristol. Is that right, Polly?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
She's translated short stories for Words Without Borders, The White Review and Granta, and her full-length translations include Friendship for Grown-Ups by Naokola Yamazaki and Mikamari by Mizumi Kubo, both from Strangers Press, and Spring Garden by Tomoka Shibasaki by Pushkin Press. After being awarded the 2019 Fitzcarraldo Editions Essay Prize, she's currently working on a non-fiction book entitled 50 Sounds. So maybe we'll talk to her about her other endeavours other than literary translation later as well. Tice is a writer and community manager at Tilted Access Press. She's an awardee of the literary fiction category for the London Writers' Awards, and she's currently writing her second novel. Again, that's the most up-to-date information that I could find. A consultant for the community project New Muslim Stories, she's passionate about helping marginalised voices reach their potential. She's previously worked at Sage Publishing and Poetry Translation Centre. And alongside her work in literature, she also creates digital art for the Barbican Centre and for other venues. So a real all-rounder, I can see it. Thank you very much for joining us again this morning. So if we start with Where the Wild Ladies Are, can you tell us a little bit about how the text came to being, how it became an English translation of the Japanese?
Yeah, for sure. I've told this story quite a few times, and each time it seems to get ramblier and ramblier, so I'm going to try very hard this time not to be too rambly. But the start of it all was a few years ago. Granta published a Japanese edition, and they had a kind of special guest editing panel in for that one, and as part of that I was asked to translate a story which is in here, Smartening Up by Aoko. And I think at the time that she wrote that, she hadn't yet conceived of writing a whole book of these contemporary feminist ghost stories. It was just a single one, but I translated that for Granta, and just really, really loved working on it. I'd been aware of Aoko's work before, but I had never translated anything by her. So I really enjoyed that, but it wasn't in the print edition, it was just online, and I kind of thought that was a one-off. But I continued to be in touch with Aoko. And then I guess the next big thing was we both, just by coincidence, ended up being in Norwich at the same time. We were doing the same residency for a month, and it happened to be that month was Women in Translation month, and this was when Deborah Smith, the founder of Tilted Access, was still based in Sheffield, and so she invited Aoko and I up to, along with a Korean author who was also in Norwich, to speak at an event that she was putting on in her event space in Sheffield to celebrate Women in Translation month. And after that we went out for dinner, her and Aoko and I, and she sort of said, we'd really like to publish something by Aoko, and Polly, we'd like you to translate it. How does that sound? And me and Aoko kind of looked at one another and said, yeah, that sounds great. And so I produced a couple of samples for Deborah of Where the Wild Ladies Are, and then another book by Aoko, but Deborah was pretty clear that Where the Wild Ladies Are was the one that she wanted to release first. So yeah, that was how it came about. And then obviously after that there were lots of, you know, funding applications, and everything took quite a while, but yeah, that's the semi-rambly story of how it came to be.
Thank you. Tisha, do you want to add anything maybe about how it kind of fits into Tilted Access's catalogue and why it would have been kind of such a perfect fit for the publishing house?
We particularly like to publish literature that has a feminist tilt. Yeah, I mean, almost all of our titles have that as one of their defining features. I also think that, and something that I'm sure everyone's noticed with this collection, is that it's very experimental and unusual, and it leans into strangenesses that perhaps more traditional publishers are shy of. So I think, well, for me, that's one of my things that I'm most excited about this collection, and Aoko's writing as well.
Thank you. We've touched on Aoko. Could you tell us a little bit more about the author and kind of how this is kind of representative of her work, and you know, what's she about?
Yeah, sure. Aoko is, how to describe Aoko? So she is an author. I think she's in her early 40s. So she's, you know, relatively early career, I suppose. She has produced, you know, I mean, generally in Japan, I would say authors tend to be more prolific than we are used to in the UK, I would say, or in Europe, in fact. So she's written lots of books of short stories, kind of novellas, interlinked short stories, essays, a couple of children's books. She's also a translator. So she translates from English into Japanese, and she's translated authors like Karen Russell and Carmen Maria Machado, and who's the other one? Amelia Gray. So, you know, similarly kind of experimental, quite biting fiction she tends to go for. And her work is often very kind of explicitly feminist, I would say. Her kind of, one of her motivating drives as an author is that she feels that in Japan, feminism is either kind of has this really kind of fusty academic aura that attaches to it, or it's associated with kind of highly strung women with a victim complex. And her aim is to take feminism and present it to people in a way that makes it very clear how it impacts their lives, and give it relevance. So, you know, she sort of really wears that on her sleeve, I think, in her writing. But then at the same time, you know, it doesn't, she always finds kind of a new way to incorporate it. And while on the one hand, the feminism aspect feels very straight up in a sense, it's also highly inventive in, you know, how it's incorporated and stuff. And I'd say that's a big thing for her. And so she's just at the beginning of this year released her first full-length novel, called The Sustainable Use of Our Souls. And that's a kind of, it's quite different to what she's done before. It's a look at, well, kind of sexism and misogyny in Japanese society, but also through the lens of idol, like pop idol culture. And she has lots of different characters and narrators, and it's quite sort of kaleidoscopic in the way that we switch. Again, very, very inventive, but I think it's wonderful. It's selling extremely well. which is really nice to see, because I think that she, you know, does well in Japan and has a very dedicated following, but she's maybe not, you know, one of the kind of top selling authors, and she hasn't yet won a major prize, and Japan is a very kind of prize driven culture, so hopefully that's, you know, that's waiting for her in the not too distant future.
She sounds fascinating. She just has a really interesting writer and person, I guess. So talking about her kind of experimentalism then, so how does this relate to this particular question? So it's a kind of a reworking of traditional ghost stories and traditional folklore. Could you tell us a little bit more about that in the source culture, and how she's used that and subverted that?
Yes, sure. So Japan has a long and very rich tradition of ghost stories. The tradition is that they are told in summer, and a kind of traditional Japanese summer pastime is to sit around, and it's called the night of 100 candles, and you sit around with 100 candles and a circle of people, and you all tell a ghost story, and when after each ghost story you blow out one of the candles, so it gradually gets darker and scarier, and you know, that's the thing. And you know, one reason why, I mean, I think it's really interesting that summer is the traditional ghost story time, because we tend to associate them with kind of cold and wintry, you know, bleak nights, I think. But there's one theory, which is that the feeling of being scared cools you down, and so it's actually quite a pragmatic tradition, because, you know, Japanese summers are extremely hard to bear, and so telling ghost stories is actually quite an effective way of having an air conditioner in the, you know, in the times before air conditioning. Anyway, so there's lots and lots of traditional ghost stories, which, you know, are part of the oral tradition and undergo various regional variations. There's also, you know, I think what we need to be really careful of when talking about Japanese ghost stories is that I think in the West we have a very clear sense of what a ghost is, you know, and it is someone in a white sheet, or it's someone, you know, who looks like they did when they were alive, where in Japan there's a much broader spectrum of different kinds of spirits, and you know that they are kind of on a spectrum also with the kami, the gods, you know, that there's just lots and lots of different kind of supernatural beings, and so there's much less division between ghosts and yokai, which are kind of more generally spirits. And you know, so for example, we see this in Where the Wild Ladies Are. There's stories of the, you know, the tree, for example, and the gum, the toad, and you know, there's many different kinds of spirits. And you know, there's at the extreme end of that, there's mononoke, which is kind of inanimate objects that have been embodied by spirits, so umbrellas or shoes, or you know, these kinds of things. Icicles, there's an icicle woman. Anyway, sorry, so this is a very, very rambly answer. So all of that you have this huge oral tradition, and then within the more organized forms of culture, we see this cropping up in various forms. So there's lots of kabuki, which is based around particular ghost stories. There's also lots of rakugo, which is a traditional form of stylized form of storytelling. And so what you often see, you know, when I was researching the stories in this book, what you often see is a is a story of a particular ghost, which will have, you know, a long oral tradition. It'll have lots of regional variations, and then it'll also have 3 different kabuki versions, 6 different rakugo versions, and you know, all of them are very slightly different, and it's very confusing it was quite confusing to research that and try and work out which one Aoko had been referencing, and occasionally it was like, wait a minute, haven't you taken elements from 2 different ones here? But that's how it works. And I think what I find really interesting is that with things like kabuki and rakugo, you know, they're very important parts of traditional Japanese heritage culture, and there's lots of people who are experts on them, and there's a lot of, you know, genuinely interesting scholarship and thought and so on, and preserving of those traditions, which is important. But there's also quite a lot of stuffiness around that, and you know, the idea of taking these stories and like making them into contemporary feminist retellings is quite shocking for some people. And I really admire the way that Aoko has done that and gone in and, you know, returned them to their kind of oral beginnings, and because you know, that's the important thing about these stories, right? They need to be continually updated, and that's how we keep them alive and keep them relevant. And I think she's really prescient and kind of brave in doing that. Sorry, that was an extremely long answer.
No, don't worry. And I got kind of pulling on, there are so many things on there that I'm going to come back to in just a minute, but kind of thinking about the fact that that what she's doing is a retelling of these, you know, these traditions. And if we can bring it into your translation, essentially that's another retelling, isn't it? It's another reworking of it again. And before we start to get into the ins and outs of the actual translation itself, could you talk us a little bit through the actual translation processes in how collaborative? Obviously, you talked about the relationship with you and Aoko is obviously really important, and it was really important in the commissioning of the text itself as well. But can you tell us a little bit how the translation process worked in terms of being collaborative, how you worked with Aoko during your translation, and maybe a little bit about the editing process as well from the point of view of the publisher, to give us an idea of how it came together kind of logistically as a text, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say that it wasn't, you know, most of the time it was just me translating. It wasn't kind of collaborative in the sense of a constant collaboration. But there were definitely times when I approached Aoko. I mean, I approached her and asked her things like, well, what gender is this person, or, you know, how many of these things are there, like specific questions. But then I also came to her with things slightly more creative reworkings that I was thinking about putting in, you know. Okay, to give you one example, there's a story in here called A Fox's Life, which is talking about how, well, it's a fox who takes on human form. And at the very beginning of this story, there's a passage where she's talking about all the time at school, people kept saying to her that she looked like a fox, and how she knew instantly that wasn't a compliment. And I just felt like that can't really work as it is in English, because we have foxy and we have, you know, oh, she's such a fox. Like, it just felt like it would be way too jarring. So I went to Aoko and said, like, look, this is the situation. I think if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of address that explicitly in English and say, like, there was a word for foxy, but she knew when they said she was a fox that they didn't mean that. And Aoko was like, yeah, of course, like, please do that. That's so interesting about English and foxy and blah, blah, blah. And those kinds of things. And, you know, there's lots of authors, I think, who really would not be amenable to that, or who I wouldn't have felt comfortable to ask that kind of stuff. So that was really nice. And I think, you know, because Aoko is a translator and has experienced the same problems kind of in reverse, she was particularly accommodating with that kind of stuff. I mean, the other big thing I would say where there was collaboration between both Aoko and Deborah and people at Tilted Axis was in creating the introductions for these works, which don't exist in the original. And, you know, the stories, the ghost stories included in this volume vary really wildly in terms of how well known they are to the average Japanese reader. And there's some which wouldn't be known at all. And I think for those ones, Aoko, you know, through the storytelling, includes all the information that you need. But I think that, you know, there's a few, maybe 6 or 7, which are just really, really standard Japanese ghost stories that everyone in Japan would know, and the average English reader would have very little idea about. And I felt like we needed to do something with those, because without that information, you just weren't coming to it in the same way. And so I spoke to Aoko and Deborah, and we talked about various possibilities. And in the end, we decided to do these introductions at the beginning of some of the stories. Actually, so that's something that's changed significantly. The Where the Wild Ladies Are has recently been published in the States by Soft Skull Press, and that's something that's changed there. So there aren't individual introductions before the beginning of the story. They are all collected at the end of the book, and we've added to them so that it's a comprehensive list. And I think I'm not quite sure about which version is better. I think there's pros and cons to both, but I think that it's really nice to have them there. And Aoko actually said after we did it, so after she published Where the Wild Ladies Are in Japan, she was surprised by the number of Japanese readers who said to her, like, actually, I didn't know this ghost story, or I wasn't aware of this. And she kind of said, I wish we'd done introductions in Japanese as well, which is nice to hear. Yeah, that was like a significant departure, and that needed collaboration. And Aoko checked those introductions and made suggestions and so on and so forth.
Thank you. I'm kind of leading on from that naturally, I guess. So talking about some of the challenges of the translation process, which I imagine there would have been an infinite number. I guess just pulling that it's the collection is so located in the source culture, yet so universal at the same time, I guess, which is I think, yeah, and I think the introductions do work in that way, that you kind of make you feel that you're entering in, but you can relate to them so well, particularly as a woman. There's so many kind of, you can feel the kind of the tradition against the modern. You could, and I'm thinking, these kind of binaries that we think about in translation as well, just seem to be there just across it. How did you kind of reconcile this kind of, maybe more at a level within the stories, kind of, the references to particular places or particular traditions or which weren't necessarily part of the introductions themselves, but there was the example of the story in the temple, particularly, where I just found that there was so much source culture information there again, that's a very long rambling question to answer. But yeah, so kind of the importance of the source culture maybe within the stories themselves rather than just the genre.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this is really a perpetual thing that I think about when I'm translating from Japanese, because a lot of stories feel really embedded within the source culture. You know, it's in some ways quite similar to Western culture, I suppose, but you know, there's lots of really specific ways in which it's different, and I think as a translator, I'm constantly thinking about that balance between overloading the reader with, you know, information that's maybe not that relevant to them, about, you know, this is a table, this is a special kind of table which is heated from the underside with a burner and you sit under it in winter. You know, I don't, and also, you know, it's not really my place to be adding too much information in, but at the same time, if you're not giving readers a context, and particularly a sort of, I think about it as a kind of an emotional context, you know, if you're just dropping in words and not giving any way of kind of unpacking those or understanding the sort of the symbolism of them, or the weight that they carry, then I think you very quickly alienate people in that way. So it's kind of treading the balance between two different forms of alienation. I mean, I would say that with Aoko, I find it maybe easier because I feel that she has, you know, there's lots of fun pop culture references, some of which need a tiny bit of tweaking, but mostly don't need tweaking at all. And, you know, it's like instantly relatable to someone who's grown up in a Western culture. And I feel like when you've got that balance, people are more likely to be able to tolerate a bit of like, oh, okay, this is really strange and I've no idea, you know, I've no reference point for that, but I can make that leap. But yeah, I really do see it as finding a balance, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things that struck me about the collection is the humor that runs through it, and I think it's so brilliantly done, because sometimes it's really tongue-in-cheek, and other times you just felt like there's almost a level of kind of sarcastic humor that runs through it as well in certain stories, and I did really love the humor. I guess the translation of humor across cultures is always going to be you know, something that's difficult. What's funny in one culture is not funny in another, and I wondered how that was in the translation process, because it's funny. I find them funny, and have you created your own kind of humor as you translated them? Is it a translation of the Japanese humor? What is Japanese humor?
First of all, thank you for saying that you find it funny. I take that as basically the highest compliment. Yeah, because I mean, for me, the humor was the real thing with this. I mean, it's humor, like you said. I mean, there are bits that are funny, I think, in genuinely almost laugh out loud funny in the original, but a lot of it is this tone, right, that runs through it, which is just so, yeah, kind of deadpan humor, or it's kind of hard to think on a kind of wryness, and that was what I felt like I really needed to, you know, without that, this book would not be a particularly successful work, I don't think. Or maybe that's unfair, but you know, that's what really makes it, I think, for me. And you know, for the most part, I think it does. It didn't need huge amounts of tweaking. It just, you know, I mean, I think it's sort of like, you know, when you're thinking about translating meaning, I mean, I sort of feel like the translation process is about sort of sucking that in and then like putting that, like spitting it out again in a way that like makes clear what the sucking in was or something. I don't know, sorry, this is terrible analogy, but what I'm trying to say is I feel like the same sort of goes for humor. Like, you, rather than directly translating what is on the page or the words, it's about finding a way to regurgitate the funniness for you, for me, in Japanese, and sometimes that ends up being very, very close to the original in terms of structure, in terms of words, in terms of all of that stuff. And sometimes it does require a kind of rejigging, but that's not what I'm conscious of when I'm doing it, if you know what I mean. I'm not thinking like, how close is this or how not close is this. It's just about sort of re-expressing that humor in the best way that I know how. Sorry, that was super.
No, that makes sense. I guess it has to be specific examples, doesn't it? I guess, to make it, to see how you've done it. But no, that it does make perfect sense. Helen has just asked, has there been any changes to the text that have been made for the US edition? Has there, in particular around humour, has there any kind of adjustments been made?
I mean, yes, there have been, but I think far fewer than there would have been for some publishers. I mean, I think so. One of the things that a few reviewers have commented on with the Tilted Axis version of this book is how British it is and how sort of shocking I think one person did actually use the word shocking. It was to see a translation that's so unashamedly British English, because I think that's I know as translators as translators who aren't American, we're often asked to translate, or it's assumed that we will translate into this mid-Atlantic English, right? And I always feel like, what is that? It doesn't exist. That doesn't exist, and I don't want to translate into an English that doesn't exist. A, and B, I mean, especially with something that's humorous, I feel like if I can't work with my own idiom, I'm good. It's like sort of, it feels like deliberately cutting off a limb or something. It's like really depriving myself of the tools that I have at my disposal. And so when I was translating this, I just didn't really think about that aspect, and then the editors that I had didn't iron it out. But I was aware that when it went to the States, that was going to be a bit of an issue. My editor at Soft Skull, Yuka Igarashi, used to be, so she's lived for quite a few years in London. She used to work for Granta magazine. And I think that helped. So some things, I think basically her thing was, we won't change anything unless it would actually be unintelligible to people in the States. So I think it still reads quite Britishly, but so there's a couple of things that she let me keep that I really would, or not even let me keep, was also very keen to keep. So for example, there's a bit where the fox woman says, "I bloody love the mountains," which is not something they would say in the States, and she was like, no, that has to stay. But I think, words, various words have changed. I think a couple of poshes have gone, and things like that. But yeah, I mean, compared to what would have happened to it if it had gone to just a standard US publisher, I think it's still very, very British.
So one last question before we go into breakout rooms. So obviously you said that Aoko is overtly feminist. I think that you could, it shouts at you. I think that, and it deals with so many issues that are so relevant to women. It subverts expectations of what women are supposed to be. You know, it deals with beauty and women's role in society and motherhood, and the tree with the breastfeeding. I do think it's amazing. And I loved the fox story as well. I think that was, yeah, I keep coming back to the fox story, but I really loved the fox story. But there's kind of 3 key male characters that keep reoccurring. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about Mr. Tay. Is it Mr. Tay? Is it? I found him fascinating, and yeah. And I was saying to Helen, I think, is that there becomes a point in the book where all of a sudden you go, oh, and I'd listened to the reading group that was done with the Borderless book club, and somebody had said that it actually reads like a novel in some ways, that it kind of, you know, you've got these standalone, but all you can see it come together almost like as little vignettes that come together to make a whole. And I think he was key to that. Yeah, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the male characters and Mr. Tay.
Yeah, for sure. I love Mr. Tay as well. And I think, you know, one of the first things that I remember about reading this book was the feeling of excitement when I realized that they were interlinked, but really not in an obvious way. I mean, I think in the West, when we say interlinked stories, we imagine, you know, it's pretty obvious. And I think there's something to me that feels really quite experimental about the way that Aoko has done this. So you kind of, I don't know if there was a while where I was sort of second guessing myself, like, are they linked or are they not? Am I kind of imagining it? And then it's like, oh, no, they are, but it's subtle, and there's different ways of doing that. And I think, you know, that sort of mysteriousness is echoed by the character of Mr. Tay himself. Actually, something that I'm kind of obsessed by at the moment, partly because I didn't fully realize this, is that one reviewer in the States pointed out that the character that is Tay means river. It's a non-standard character for river, and in Japan the myth of when you die, it's you cross the river, and so I think this, and Aoko was really delighted when someone, you know, in the States pointed this out, because she was like, no, none of the Japanese reviewers picked this up, and you know, and I think that really speaks to what she envisaged with him, which is this kind of liminal position, but also this kind of, you know, serpentine sort of fluid, not really pin downable element as well. There was one point in the translation process where I approached Aoko and asked her for more details about Mr. Tay. It wasn't as general as that. It was something more specific. It was about his job title. And she was just very much like, we don't know that. You know, it was like, I don't know it, and you're not going to know it, and no one's going to know it, and it's really important that she didn't say this last bit, but what I got from her words was like, it's really important that we preserve this mystery around this character, because this is, you know, what we've got. So yeah, that's Mr. Tay in a nutshell, I'd say.
It's really funny listening to you talk, because that's how I saw he's like this. He infiltrates everything. He slips in and moves across everything, and you know, yeah, it's brilliant, really good. Thank you. I think we could talk. I've got so many other questions that I could ask you, but we'll break out into the breakout rooms now. So I've put you all in 4 different rooms, so there's kind of either 6 or 7 of you in a room. I've gone for 12 minutes just because we're running a little bit short on time. So you can talk about, you know, if you've only read one of the stories, it doesn't matter. We can talk about the experience that you've had of reading 1 or 2, whatever it is. you talk about maybe things, you know, some of the things of the translation process that you might like to consider, or thematically, however your discussion wants to go, really. And then, yeah, if you could nominate somebody to feedback, and when I say feedback, just really quickly, just a, you know, just a you know, half a minute or so, a minute, just to kind of, so we get an idea of, you know, what the groups have talked about, and see what, if there's anything in common, or, you know, different perspectives that might have happened, which I think would be really interesting. It's kind of the best way of doing this with so many others. So I'm gonna.
Can I just say something, Jennifer?
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I mean, and even those of you who haven't had time to read anything, because I know that you're all in pressure at the moment, you know, have the discussion based on what you've been hearing about the stories, and I'm sure there will be things that will have grabbed you as you've been hearing Polly and Jennifer talking, and also Tice's input at the beginning. So, and any questions, and even more general questions that you might have about the process of literary translation, you know, please don't feel you can't discuss it if you haven't read, because you've been hearing so much about it in this session already. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to send you all off now, and there'll be a countdown at the end. So you'll have kind of, it'll count down to say that you've got 60 seconds left, and then you should all just come back into the main room again at the end of it. I just hope we don't lose people in the vortex of the chat rooms now, the breakout rooms, that we managed to gather everybody back together again. Okay, it looks like everybody's back and nobody has got lost in the vortex of the breakout rooms, which is great. I hope that was useful. I hope that we got some good discussion. I popped into to breakout room 1, and there was definitely some good discussion. It would be great if we could get a little bit of feedback. You're happy to unmute yourselves as to whoever it is that has been volunteered or volunteered themselves to do it. Should we start with breakout room 2? Does somebody want to give them some feedback about the things that you're talking about breakout room 2?
We were very disobedient and didn't appoint a rapporteur, I'm afraid.
So is that going to be you then, Helena?
But sorry, but I'm just wondering whether, Aisling, do you want to, seeing as you were kind of leading the discussion? Or
sorry, I seem to be having some problems with my camera, so apologies. But we were kind of mainly talking about the publishing process and the relationship between authors and translators, and that it was really fascinating that there was such a kind of duality to the process. It wasn't just kind of, you know, they were working very closely together to translate the work. And then we were also talking to Tice about kind of the audience of a translation, and she was talking about a new Tibetan poetry collection that's coming out soon, and or next year, and the kind of you know, understanding the audience for a language that might not have the same pull as Japanese literature might, which is interesting as well, because some of us are doing minority languages in RMA. So it was a really interesting conversation.
Good. And it's interesting how that you know that it can be a kind of springboard to lots of other different discussion points as well, can't it? Thank you, Aisling. Breakout room 3. Is there somebody who?
Hi, I think that was Yeah.
Hi, Shauna.
Hi. Yeah. I think, yeah, I was in room 3, wasn't I? Sorry, I didn't even check to see. We were basically just discussing the humor running through the story and stuff, and our reaction to that. It was definitely, as myself and I think Emma and some of the others kind of agreed as well, that it was kind of some moments where like laugh out loud, especially that there was one story that stood out for me. I'm not sure how connected it was to superstitions and ghosts, but it was the jealousy one. You know, where there's this whole, they explain the whole process of a woman's anger and chucking things everywhere. I mean, my first thought of that was kind of what you'd see in EastEnders or something. I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but this whole kitchen scene where she's just catching crockery and firing it everywhere, and that was expressed as a positive thing. So it was interesting to think about how a target audience over here in possibly in Great Britain or Ireland or anywhere English-speaking country or region, you know, how they'd react to that. But I think it was, well, from my point of view, it was I got a kick out of it. It was quite it was quite humorous. But I was just wondering what traditions that was kind of relating to. It was hard to pick out, but it was kind of I suppose it was a bit unexpected, but it was fun to read. So we were just talking about things like that, the kind of, yeah, I suppose it's a bit of a touch on the modern as well, and how it's integrated into this collection of ghost stories and superstitions. So yeah, it was good. It was really good.
Thank you. Yeah, no, you're right. I think in the group that I was in as well, we were kind of talking about how this, as Polly was saying, this kind of deadpan humour that's just there, and it kind of lulls you into this like almost false sense of security of where the story is going, and then all of a sudden just goes, oh no, it's not that, it's not what you think, and it just kind of dumps it in there really quickly. And I think the humour has a lot to do with that, I think, as well, that, you know, and another thing that we were talking about in the group that I was in is about the kind of that we were talking about expectations of ghost stories, and we were talking about how you expect it to be like a real division between what's real and what's not real, and it's not there. That all you kind of, you start to forget what's real and what's not real, or it starts to become unimportant what's real and not real, and you start to accept, like, just let yourself be taken by kind of the supernatural things that are going on, I guess. Breakout room 4. Is there anybody to feed back from breakout room 4? No. Silence. So I was met with silence. Maybe I should just appoint somebody next time. Okay, no worries. If you have got anything that you can put, if you don't want to speak, if somebody wants to put anything in the chat, then you're more than welcome to do it by the chat.
If you like, I'll give a little bit of feedback. Sorry.
Thank you.
So we talked about specific characters that we really liked, and we talked about the first story, how it was difficult to know. As you said, sometimes you didn't realize until halfway through the story who was the ghost and who was still alive. So we really liked that kind of, as Jessie described it, it was very fluid, sort of fluid process where you figured it out. And we were talking about the character in the first story, about how his whole self-respect and his whole opinion of himself was tied up in his job, and the fact that he was unemployed rendered him almost invisible to other people. And then we discussed the aunt in the story, about the aunt who visited her niece in her apartment and criticized her, and how her relationship, how her whole self-image was also tied up with the relationship with the father of her child. So I found that really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess there's so much that we could talk about, and so many different aspects. Yeah, so many different stories that we could go down. We could probably talk about hours. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. We also really liked the introductions and felt they really helped with our enjoyment of the stories, while keeping the Japanese culture, where, you know, you didn't lose anything from the point of view of Japanese culture, but you were put right into it by the introduction. We really enjoyed those.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for feeding back. Yeah, I think I've mentioned everything that we pretty much what we talked about. And I think we might go down with the other question. We talked about the feminism in different cultures as well, and how that's a bit I think that might take us down a long route. And I kind of want to get into the last section of the session before we run out of time. And so thank you everybody for reading the text and for joining in the discussions. It's brilliant, and it'd be great to get feedback if you enjoyed it to do something like this again. To finish off the session, I kind of wanted to widen the discussion for you so that we could get a little bit of insight into kind of the publishing industry and what it's like to be a literary translator for anybody who's interested in literary translation as a career. So if we can maybe just start with Tisha, and she could talk to us a little bit about Tilted Access Press, how it was formed. I know we've talked a little bit about the kind of texts and that kind of thing that you tend to promote, essentially, I guess, in kind of an ambassadorial way. But if you could maybe talk to us maybe a little bit about how you contract your translators as well, how you commission your texts, and that kind of thing would be, I think, really interesting for everyone to hear.
So to start with, I'll tell you a little bit about Tilted Access. So we were founded in 2015 by Deborah Smith, and Deborah, some people might know her as the translator of The Vegetarian by Han Kang. And so it felt like kind of like a logical development for her to then go on to found a press, and through that, a press that translated Asian literature. I think for me, sorry by the way, there's some noise in the background. I think for me and a lot of the team, we're passionate about making sure that translation is not an invisible hand in the text. So we like the circularity of translation to be felt in the text, both through how it's published, but also in how we talk about the books post-publication, which is my job, and the rest of the teams also as well. I mean, we all talk about the text online as well. I have to say that we're a small team, so a lot of it is, like the 8 of us tweeting enthusiastically about the books. With how we commission text, I think it's very different for each project. As Polly was saying, that started with a phone call with this particular book. I'm sorry, not a phone call, like an in-person chat. And with Jeremy Chung, it was who's the translator for a book of ours that we've got coming out in a couple of weeks called The Strange Beasts of China. He connected with Deborah online. Deborah had just been reading lots of his articles and things like this and knew he was a translator to watch. And then she also heard about Younger, the author, separately to him. And then those two conversations started to gel. So it happens a lot like that. We rarely take submissions because we're so small. So it will usually be, sometimes it will be geo-specific. So if we're aware, for example, that we want to focus on a text from Central Asia, we'll have our eye out, which is how we came across Hamid Ismailov, who is a writer from Uzbekistan. So sometimes it's geo-specific, sometimes it's come from a good chat, and sometimes it will be from things that we've read online and just keeping our eyes open.
Can we talk about the corona-shaped elephant in the room and how has the pandemic affected or has it affected Tilted Access?
I think what we've found hard is that some of the plans that we had in place for our books were no longer possible, like festival appearances and things such as this, and also I think there's a lot to be said about cover value and people being able to walk into bookshops and see our very beautiful covers. And we have missed that. But I think we're really lucky. For example, Polly you've been amazing. Like you just joining Instagram lives and just being really, really up for digital sharings of the book. So I think we are lucky. more lucky than some, because we work with such amazing people who are really keen on like adapting to the circumstances. And I think with some of the restraints of Corona, they perhaps weren't as severe for us as well, because the team was already mobile, so we weren't giving up an office space.
Yeah. Has it affected sales? Has it affected?
It has affected sales, but like not as much as like Penguin lost an unbelievable amount. I can't remember the exact number, but I remember just being absolutely shocked by it. Whereas with us, because a lot of our sales come from our website, it hasn't impacted them as severely. And I think that's one of the values of indie publishing, just that people know to buy books from the publishers themselves. So there's less room for error in that way, because there's already that relationship set up. We don't have to introduce that relationship to our market. And even, for example, well, I think the difference between us and some other indie presses as well is just that we have a subscription list in place as well. So people who signed up for our books at the beginning of the year are still receiving them, and that's helped us a lot. I think that's been a massive stream of income that we have been held by. And then we've also had our best sellers, such as Where the Wild Ladies Are. It's really been a lift for us. So really good.
What about your reader? Who's the reader of your text? Do you have a reader? Do you have a market?
I think, I'm not sure if you would agree, Polly, but we try not to think too much about the reader in terms of how we position or shape a text until like the very, very late stage, because Anton Her was saying it in a way that's a bit better than how I'm wording it now, but just if we keep thinking of this ideal reader that's like super cool with everything, or really not tolerant, if we're panicked about this reader, so I think sometimes the experimental texts in particular aren't given a good space. But I suppose, not to be too panicky, my ideal reader for a tilted axis book, such as this one, is someone who is happy with being thrown in at the deep end, and who isn't necessarily expecting a linear narrative, and someone who will talk to us about the books afterwards. We love talking to our readers.
And what about so the kind of the bigger publishers that are kind of slightly risk averse of publishing in translation, because supposedly always Anglophone readers don't read in translation, and we're reluctant to read in translation. How much do you think that's true, and how much do you think it's kind of to do with positioning of a text in a shop, or the availability or the visibility of a text?
I think, and apologies if I've had this incorrect, but I think with larger publishers, it really depends on who's the commissioning editor at various places, because so much of it is in people who have like a natural leaning towards buying certain books. Often the books that, we've published some books that have been turned down by larger publishers that have then gone on to be bestsellers, and we've had chats with those editors that are like, I should have bought that book, I should have brought it in, and that's I guess that's just one of the things that make us we're kind of happy when that happens. So not in an evil way. Obviously we want we want our translators and authors to go with like the best publisher for them, but we're really happy when we've nabbed something that maybe we saw a potential in it, that if someone had had their coffee that morning, maybe they'd have seen the potential too, and it's just been like an ephemeral slip in judgment. But a lot of things, I can't stress the importance of booksellers enough, and in having those organic relationships with other people in the publishing chain. Tilted Axis have a lot of really tight relationships with certain bookshops, and they're the ones who champion our titles, and book our authors and translators for events. And I think because that relationship is so informal too, and we go in and we say hello, and it's very impersonal a lot of the time. It helps during times like Corona, for example. Those existing relationships have been things that we've been able to just remain within, rather than, I think I think right now it's a lot harder to create new relationships and new partnerships.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I've got a million other questions and we're running out of time. But thank you so much. We can move on to Polly. Can you give us a kind of a whistle-stop tour through your background and how you came to be a literary translator? Polly, you need to unmute yourself.
Right, yeah, sure. Okay, so I didn't do languages at university. I actually studied philosophy, and then I went and taught on the JET program, which is a teaching program in Japan, and I was placed on a very remote island there and learnt Japanese and stayed for a couple of years, then came back to the UK and found a job in a small Japanese publisher, and that was where I first started translating, even though I was really not at a level where I should have been translating, but I started anyway and really quickly realised that I loved it very much. So continued to study Japanese. I did a master's at SOAS, which is part of the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. And then I kind of basically, I started out, after the master's, I started out in doing commercial translating, mostly like computer games, but also gradually doing more and more literary stuff. And then went back to live in Japan, and essentially while I was in Japan made the transition into just doing full-time. I mean, even these days I'm not a full-time literary translator. I do maybe half literature and then art related stuff, so stuff for catalogues and things like that. Yeah, and then recently also I'm doing a bit of my own stuff, own writing stuff. But yeah, that's basically the overall trajectory. It's very non-linear and I feel like if there was a book to play by, I might have at least looked at that book, but my sense was that there was no specific way in literature translation. I guess the traditional way for Japanese at least is through the academic route, but I very much did not do that. So, I'm a bit of an outsider. So.
I don't know, I think there's a lot of translators who end up doing it by accident as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
How much of your do you do just literary translation, or do you do a kind of commercial translation as well? And how much of your kind of what you do is just translation? Do you do, and how much do you do kind of other events and other stuff to kind of to make a living?
I think that half. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't think of the art-related stuff that I do as particularly commercial. I mean, when I was doing game work, it very much felt like, okay, this is the stuff that I don't like, that I do to make money. And this is the stuff that I enjoy that makes no money. And these days, that it's not like that. It's much, much more blurred for me. And I wouldn't do the art-related stuff if I didn't really enjoy it. Or I'd find some other way of supplementing my income. So yeah, about half, I suppose. Yeah. But in terms of events and things, these days I'm doing a lot more of that kind of thing. And mentoring. I've recently taken on my first mentee. And that, I mean, that's interesting. That I don't think of that as necessarily like the events that I do I don't know, you know, I kind of have seen them as a different thing, like not really work. It's like something else that I do that kind of feeds into the whole thing, but gradually the more time that's taking up, that is actually becoming a part of what I do. So I guess that's another transition that's in the process of, yeah.
And the texts that you translate, do you pitch them? Do publishers approach you? Do you do sample translations and kind of compete for the text, or is it a mixture of all of those things? Or
all of those. I mean, everything that I've worked on has come to me in a different way. Okay. You know, there's not been so recent. I've got a book coming out with Bloomsbury at the end of this month, and that is the first book that I have pitched from scratch. You know, and all the time that I've been translating, that's been very much the model that's been presented to me. It's like, as a translator of a minority language, I don't really think of Japanese as a minority, but you know, it's not European, so therefore in the UK market it counts as minority. You go out, you find a book you like, you do a sample, you go and do your elevator pitch, you know, and until now that hasn't, well, I've tried to do that and it hasn't worked, but also like that I've been, you know, I've had projects that have come to me another way, so I haven't needed to do that. So yeah, a real mix.
Has it, the fact that you've kind of gained a reputation helped you to get to the point where you can pitch a book and it and people listen to you and take you seriously, I guess, as well?
I think it is reputation a little bit, but I think a lot of it is what TJ was saying about these organic relationships. It's like having these people that you know, you don't have to corner at London Book Fair and be like, please listen to me. It's like just more that you can, you know, have a chat on the phone and they'll listen to you. That I think is more important than them necessarily thinking that you're a great translator.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess all of those kind of things end up going hand in hand a little bit.
Do. Yeah, I think they do, definitely.
If you had any top tips for people who want to be a literary translator, what would they be? Should I have asked you that before?
No. Read a lot. I mean, that sounds obvious, but read a lot and read widely. Like, read translated fiction, read in the source language, read in the target language, and be observant when you're reading. You know, don't just kind of zone out, but like be thinking about things. I think that, I mean, it kind of annoys me now that often when I'm reading a Japanese book, it's like there's the translator in me that's like, oh, what would I do about that? It's like, just shut up. I just want to enjoy this for today. But I think having that, being able to activate that part of your brain.
And how important, I guess we've touched on that a little bit, but networking, I guess, is also important, isn't it? In terms of things like summer schools and mentorships and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a real block at the beginning because I thought of it as networking and I found that so grim as a prospect, you know? And then once I realised that it was just, I don't know, going out and meeting people who were nice often, and, you know, not necessarily having to do with, you know, if you don't like people, you don't have to do that much with them. I think that's kind of, yeah. But I think mostly in the translation community, you know, we're quite lucky. I think people are quite good. They tend to be quite good. That's my experience. Yeah. I think, you know, part of this whole thing of organic relationships, reputation, blah, 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 like another really important bit, and it's very nebulous, but is confidence. And I think people say, you know, be confident. And I think that's really redundant advice. But what is not redundant advice, I think, is like find a community where you feel supported, and then you will feel more confident, and then people will want to trust you more, you know, and it's
yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. I guess a little bit chicken and eggy though, isn't it?
totally, yes, yeah.
And my last question, I guess, is also the corona shaped elephant in the room. Have you been affected by the pandemic? Has work been affected, in apart from kind of like actual, like kind of receiving work, I guess, and was that obviously the events and things that can't happen? But
I mean, for me it's been quite weird because the real crunch time, corona crunch time, I was supposed to be sitting and writing my book anyway, so I did that, and and around that stuff has not really been affected as far as I'm aware. You know, I mean, like Bloomsbury, for example, who I'm publishing this book with, like they've done incredibly well this year. Like their sales figures have increased, and no one's really quite sure why. But I mean, so I think it really is like Penguin obviously haven't done well, but I think with the publishing world, I mean, and maybe Tia would disagree, but like it seems it's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And there are, yeah, for me personally, I think I've come out of it remarkably well. I'm incredibly lucky to, you know, a lot of my friends have just had no work for 6 months, and that has not been my experience.
Yeah, that's good to hear. That's good to actually to positive, both of them from Tilted Access as well, and yourself, that it's good to hear that it's not all doom and gloom everywhere. Well, I'm very conscious of time, and I've managed to, by my clock, it's 12 o'clock on the dot. And I would say a huge thank you to Polly and Tisha for joining us this morning, and for giving up the
Thank you all so much.
a virtual applause to both of you.
Thank you. It's been really great. I didn't realise it was the first instalment of this, so I feel very honoured to have been part of it.
Yeah, no, yes, thank you. No, you set the bar very high. And thank you everybody else for joining in, for taking part in the discussion, for listening and everything, and we will hopefully do something again very soon. And yeah, Helena said that you must visit us in Cork.
Oh yes, please. Yes.
You should expect us.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, well, we'll do it when the pubs are open, shall we?
That's a good way to structure it.
So thank you everybody, and we'll see you all soon for the next instalment of the reading groups. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.